Hey guys, tonight we're heading to 19th century Paris, where luxury perfumes weren't just about scent but status. Picture the streets of Paris bustling with fashionable elites, flamboyant dresses, smooth opera melodies, and the unmistakable scent of expensive fragrances wafting through the air. This was the heart of the perfume industry, where the rich and famous indulged in the world's finest scents. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to post where you're from and what time it is where you are. It's always fun to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Perfume was the essence of Parisian society, a symbol of refinement and taste. The elite were willing to pay top dollar for exquisite perfumes that promised to add a touch of elegance to their persona. But amid the glamour, something unusual was brewing. A shadowy figure, more devious than sophisticated, was preparing to cash in on this fragrant world. In the midst of this scented paradise, counterfeiters began to see an opportunity. As fragrance became more integral to social status, the demand for high-end perfumes exploded. But the cost of real luxury was too steep for many. So, why not make a profit from selling something that looked just as good, but with a fraction of the price tag? That's exactly what one group of swindlers did, setting the stage for a scandal that would rattle Paris to its very core. Imagine walking through the cobbled streets of Paris, where luxury stores gleamed in the soft glow of street lamps. The perfume boutiques sat like hidden gems, each one promising an experience of elegance and allure. To the untrained eye, these stores appeared flawless. But beneath the surface, the faintest whispers of something amiss began to circulate. A counterfeit perfume syndicate, run by some of the most ingenious minds of the time, was quietly taking root. While the wealthy were indulging in their luxurious purchases, a few clever individuals were setting up their own little empire of deception. The perfume was made to look authentic, to smell authentic, and to be sold for the same exorbitant prices as the real deal. The operation was small at first, hidden in the quiet corners of Paris, and the perfumes were so well crafted, it was nearly impossible for anyone to tell the difference. How could they? The bottles, the labels, even the scents themselves were near-perfect replicas. It wasn't until a few well-placed bottles of fake perfume began to pop up in the hands of the high society that someone started asking questions. Who was behind this sudden flood of counterfeit fragrances? And why did it seem like nobody could detect the difference? The truth behind the swindle was about to be uncovered, but not before it had grown into something much bigger than anyone could have expected. The mastermind behind it all, a person whose name would go down in the annals of forgotten crime history, had an uncanny ability to mimic every detail of the perfume-making process. Bottles were sourced from suppliers who had no idea they were helping criminals. Labels were forged with meticulous detail, and the perfumes themselves were carefully crafted to mimic the most famous scents of the time. And yet, nobody suspected anything until it was far too late. As the counterfeit perfume syndicate began to spread its reach, the figure behind the operation remained shadowed, hidden in plain sight. No one could have predicted that one of the wealthiest and most influential perfume makers in Paris would be the mastermind of this swindle. Their name was whispered in the dark alleys of Paris, but only those deeply embedded in the perfume world truly knew of their criminal ingenuity. But even they couldn't guess the extent of the fraud until the first hints of the operation came to light. The ringleader, known only to a few, wasn't your typical criminal. They were a master of subtlety, someone who thrived in the quiet spaces where business overlapped with deception. The perfume empire they built wasn't about violence or threats, it was about precision. Each step was carefully calculated, a well-oiled machine that depended on meticulous planning and flawless execution. The mastermind knew that in order to succeed, they couldn't just create a subpar imitation. No, the key was to make the fake perfume so indistinguishable from the real thing that no one would suspect anything was amiss. It wasn't just about making the perfume itself, it was about crafting a complete illusion. The labels, the packaging, and even the tiny details like the weight of the bottle, all of it had to be perfect. The mastermind went so far as to ensure that the fake perfume came in the same luxurious glass bottles that held the finest scents. The labels were printed using the same methods as the originals, and the fonts were indistinguishable from the real deal. The ringleader's obsession with perfection ensured that the counterfeit perfume could easily slip into the most prestigious Parisian boutiques, posing as the genuine article. It was this attention to detail that made the scheme so dangerous. The counterfeit perfume wasn't something that could easily be spotted. It was a well-executed replica of a high-end luxury product. And when wealthy buyers began to fall for it, the syndicate expanded rapidly. You may be wondering, how exactly did this perfume syndicate create such a convincing ruse? The answer lies in the fascinating process of perfume creation, an art form that requires both chemistry and creativity. But the counterfeiters weren't just mimicking the scent, they were mimicking the very essence of luxury. The perfume-making process they used to craft their fakes was an intricate blend of science and deception, a clever dance between materials and methods that made even the most experienced noses second-guess themselves. The fragrance itself was key to the success of this scheme. To the untrained nose, these perfumes could have been from any of the major Parisian perfume houses. They used the same ingredients, exquisite flowers, rare oils, and intoxicating essences, and replicated the same techniques that the high-end perfumers employed. The only difference was that the ingredients were cheaper and the perfumes were produced in bulk, reducing costs significantly. The counterfeiters knew they couldn't compete with the famous brands on price, so they aimed for perfection in every other detail. Creating a fragrance that could pass as the real thing was no easy feat. It involved sourcing quality, but less expensive, ingredients and blending them in a way that made them almost indistinguishable from the top-tier perfumes. One would think that only the most experienced perfumers could pull this off, but the syndicate employed a mix of lesser-known artisans and chemists, individuals who were skilled in their craft but weren't necessarily part of the glamorous Parisian perfume scene. This added an extra layer of invisibility to their operation. The result: a scent that was so close to the original that even the most discerning buyers, who paid top dollar for their fragrances, couldn't tell the difference. It was a perfume for the masses, but wrapped in the glamour of the elite. And all of this was hidden in plain sight, behind the counters of the most reputable perfume stores in Paris. As the counterfeit perfumes began to flow smoothly through the Parisian markets, the buyers were none the wiser. High society women, with their powdered faces and elegant gowns, picked up bottles of what they believed to be the finest luxury fragrances. The shops had been duped, the sellers too eager to keep up with demand. No one suspected that their prized scent could have come from a humble workshop rather than a prestigious perfumery. For months, the syndicate operated under the radar, quietly filling their pockets with the profits of their deceptive empire. But not everyone was so easily fooled. There were whispers, soft, hesitant murmurs among a few perfume aficionados who noticed something strange. Maybe it was the subtle scent that didn't quite last as long as the expensive perfumes, or perhaps the bottles felt too light, as though they had been hastily crafted. There were small inconsistencies that only the most discerning noses could pick up. But in the world of luxury perfumes, who had the time to investigate every bottle? One person who did have the time, however, was an investigator who had been brought into the case of a missing aristocrat. This case was hardly related to the counterfeit perfumes, but it led him to the very shops where the fake perfumes were being sold. The missing woman's last known purchase was a rare, expensive fragrance. It was this odd coincidence that caught the investigator's attention. He had seen the name of the perfume before, but not in the luxury perfume store. Intrigued, he began his own quiet investigation into the scent, discovering that the perfume wasn't authentic at all. It was this small detail, an inconsistency in a missing person's case, that would bring down an empire of deception. The investigator's suspicion led him to a trail that, when followed, slowly unraveled the entire syndicate. It was like pulling at a loose thread. What started as a seemingly unrelated disappearance spiraled into a full-blown fraud investigation that would eventually shake the perfume industry to its core. Once the investigator had started digging, the cracks in the operation began to widen. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that what seemed like a minor issue, one small bottle of counterfeit perfume, was actually the tip of a massive iceberg. What started as a hunch quickly turned into a full-fledged investigation. The perfumeries were buzzing with fear, the syndicate's grip on Paris tightening with every passing day. The scent of deception was in the air, and the consequences of this hidden crime were about to make waves far beyond the perfume industry. The investigator didn't work alone for long. Word of his findings spread, and soon he had the support of officials from the French government, who were equally concerned about the implications of such a widespread fraud. This wasn't just about perfumes anymore. It was about the integrity of one of Paris's most beloved industries. The authorities couldn't afford to let the swindle go unchecked. What followed was a methodical series of raids on perfume stores and suppliers across Paris. In the quiet hours of the morning, as the city's early risers began their day, officers swooped in, examining inventory, looking for counterfeit bottles among the sea of genuine perfumes. The counterfeiters' operation was revealed in shocking detail. They had not only replicated the fragrances, but also forged documents, used fake company names, and bribed suppliers to look the other way. As the full scale of the operation was exposed, the perfume world was thrown into disarray. Shop owners, who had once prided themselves on stocking only the finest scents, were now faced with the grim reality that their shelves had been filled with fake goods. The trust of Parisian society in their favorite perfume brands was shattered. Wealthy patrons who had spent fortunes on exotic perfumes found that their prized scents were nothing more than cleverly crafted imitations. But the mastermind behind it all wasn't finished yet. The investigation had only revealed a fraction of the syndicate's reach, and with each new discovery came the realization that there were still many more hidden players in this elaborate scheme. As the raids continued, the mastermind of the perfume syndicate remained elusive, slipping through the fingers of the investigators. Despite the mounting evidence against the operation, the leaders seemed to have anticipated every move. It was almost as if they had been playing a long, quiet game of cat and mouse, staying just one step ahead. The authorities had only captured a handful of low-level co-conspirators, employees of the perfume shops, suppliers who had turned a blind eye, and a few lesser criminals who had been recruited for their technical skills. But the true head of the operation, the mastermind who had orchestrated the entire fraud from behind the scenes, was nowhere to be found. The case became more and more frustrating for the authorities. The syndicate's ability to operate in the shadows, using clever methods to avoid detection, made it seem almost invincible. The mastermind had anticipated the possibility of an investigation and had taken precautions to protect their identity. They had used fake names, run their operation through third parties, and avoided direct contact with the products themselves. It was a case of pure genius, one that seemed nearly impossible to crack. But the investigator, determined not to let the case fade away, began to uncover small, telling details that the syndicate had overlooked. A few too many mistakes, seemingly innocuous, began to surface. In one of the counterfeit perfume bottles, a tiny flaw was discovered in the glass, a signature detail that only the highest-end perfume makers could have replicated. The flaw was a small, almost imperceptible difference, but to a trained eye, it was a clue that could lead directly to the source of the operation. The investigator's breakthrough came when he linked this small defect to a particular factory on the outskirts of Paris. This factory had long been considered a minor supplier to some of the city's biggest perfumeries. No one had suspected it as a point of origin, but when the investigator traced the faulty bottles back to it, he finally began to see the threads pull together. What had once seemed like a random collection of incidents now formed a clear pattern. The syndicate's mastermind had used this very factory to produce the counterfeit bottles, cleverly concealing their involvement behind layers of deception. Now that the investigator had a solid lead, the pressure was on. The factory on the outskirts of Paris was a nondescript, modest building tucked away behind towering warehouses and forgotten alleys. It was an unlikely place for a major criminal operation to thrive, which is exactly what made it such a perfect hiding spot. On the surface, it appeared to be just another small-scale manufacturer producing generic items for various industries. But in reality, it had become the epicenter of an underground perfume empire. The investigation team moved quickly, strategizing how to approach the factory without tipping off the syndicate. They knew that time was of the essence. If the mastermind got wind of their plans, the entire operation could vanish in the blink of an eye. Disguising their intentions, the investigators set up a covert operation, arriving at the factory under the guise of routine checks. They were hoping to catch the criminals off guard, to uncover the machines, the raw materials, and most importantly, the evidence of counterfeit perfume production. Inside the factory, they found what they were looking for and more. It wasn't just the bottles of fake perfume that were hidden away. It was the entire infrastructure that had been built to support the operation. Large vats of cheap, synthetic oils were stored in the back, ready to be blended into the fake fragrances. Bottles, labels, and packaging were prepared in another area, all waiting to be assembled into the perfect counterfeit. The scale of the operation was far greater than anyone had anticipated. But the investigators didn't find just raw materials. They also uncovered a series of ledgers detailing every transaction, every shipment, every buyer, and every accomplice. The mastermind had kept meticulous records, ensuring that the operation ran smoothly and that no one would be left behind. The detailed logs provided insight into the inner workings of the syndicate, revealing the names of suppliers, buyers, and even corrupt middlemen in perfume shops. It was a treasure trove of evidence that could bring the entire organization to its knees. However, just as the investigators began to gather their findings, a twist emerged. One of the workers in the factory tipped off the mastermind. It seemed that the syndicate had eyes everywhere. With the operation at risk of being exposed, the mastermind made a swift escape, disappearing into the night. The escape of the mastermind only intensified the stakes. Paris, a city once known for its romance and elegance, was now a hotbed of intrigue, with whispers of the perfume Swindle spreading faster than the fragrant oils themselves. The investigator, despite the setback, wasn't about to let the case slip away. It had become personal. This wasn't just about tracking down a criminal syndicate. It was about restoring the trust and reputation of Paris's iconic perfume industry, which had been tarnished by the operation. With the mastermind on the run, the authorities turned their attention to the people who had unwittingly helped fuel the fraud. The suppliers and the boutique owners who had stocked the counterfeit perfumes. Many of these individuals had no idea they were contributing to the scheme, but some were more complicit than they let on. The investigation began to zero in on those who had actively aided the syndicate, from the factory workers who had processed the fake ingredients, to the middlemen who had transported the bottles to the high-end shops across Paris. In one particular case, a small perfume shop owner who had been unknowingly selling fake perfume to her wealthy clientele was confronted by the investigators. She had built her business on trust, offering only the finest scents to her loyal customers. The shock of discovering that her best-selling perfumes were counterfeit left her devastated. But it wasn't just her business that had suffered. Her reputation, built over decades, had crumbled in an instant. The pressure from the investigation weighed heavily on her, and she became one of the first to cooperate, revealing everything she knew about the operation. Meanwhile, the mastermind remained elusive, never leaving a trace. It was as if they had vanished from the city entirely, slipping into the shadows where no one could find them. The authorities suspected that they might have left Paris altogether, but no one knew for certain. The scent of danger still lingered in the air, though, and the investigators continued to chase every lead, hoping to corner the elusive figure who had sparked such a massive scandal. The hunt for the mastermind continued, but with each passing day, the case seemed to grow colder. Yet, the sting of the swindle would not fade. Paris's perfume industry, though tarnished, had learned some valuable lessons about oversight and trust. The question remained, who was behind it all, and would they ever be brought to justice? The mystery of the mastermind deepened as the weeks turned into months. Despite the authorities' best efforts, the elusive criminal slipped further into the shadows, leaving no trace of their whereabouts. The investigation had stalled. No more breakthroughs, no more arrests. It was as if the syndicate had been nothing but a whisper, a fleeting scent in the wind. Paris, a city that once thrived on the elegance of its perfumes, was now haunted by a lingering distrust. But as the case began to lose its heat, something unexpected happened. A small detail, barely noticeable, reignited the investigation. It was a letter, an old-fashioned, carefully folded piece of paper that appeared on the desk of the lead investigator. The letter contained no name, no return address, only a few cryptic words. The scent of truth is stronger than any imitation. At first, it seemed like a prank, but when the investigator looked closer, he noticed something remarkable. The paper smelled faintly of perfume. Not just any perfume, but one of the most distinctive and expensive scents on the market. A fragrance that had been replicated in the counterfeit bottles. The message was clear. The mastermind was still in Paris, playing their game from afar, mocking the investigators who had chased them for so long. This cryptic clue turned the investigation on its head. With a renewed sense of determination, the authorities focused on retracing the path of the letter. They discovered that it had been delivered to the investigator through a network of trusted couriers who had no idea of the letter's true origin. The scent on the paper was the key. It was a signature left intentionally, a challenge to those who dared to uncover the truth. The trail led them back to the factory on the outskirts of Paris, the very place where the swindle had begun. The investigators combed through the location once again, this time with renewed focus. They searched every inch of the building, every corner, every hidden room. And there, in a forgotten office, they found what they had been looking for: a set of old, dusty blueprints. These weren't just plans for the factory. They were meticulously drawn-out schemes for an even larger operation, one that spanned beyond the borders of France. It became clear that this counterfeit perfume syndicate wasn't just a small-scale operation. It was part of something much larger, and the mastermind had been preparing for something even more ambitious than anyone had imagined. With the discovery of the blueprints, the scale of the operation became even more shocking. The counterfeit perfume syndicate had plans not only for Paris, but for the entire perfume market across Europe. The mastermind, it seemed, had envisioned a global empire built on deception. The blueprints detailed the construction of new factories, secret supply chains, and a network of distributors that stretched across several countries. This wasn't just about making fake perfumes to sell locally. It was about establishing a widespread underground business that would flood the market with counterfeit luxury fragrances. The realization hit the investigators hard. This wasn't a case of one person making a quick profit. This was an orchestrated operation that had been years in the making, designed to slowly infiltrate the perfume industry at a global scale. The mastermind had been playing the long game, and they weren't just after money. They were after control. Control of the high-end fragrance market. Control of Paris's beloved perfume industry. It was an audacious, carefully crafted scheme to change the very fabric of luxury perfume production. As the authorities began to piece together the full picture, they realized the mastermind had already anticipated this moment, the moment when they would be uncovered. The elaborate network they had put in place was a failsafe. Even if the investigators closed in on one piece of the operation, there were always more layers waiting to be exposed. The syndicate had already planned for their eventual downfall, with enough red herrings and misdirections to keep the authorities chasing their tails for years. One particular section of the blueprints caught the attention of the investigator: a detailed map of Paris, with certain areas marked in red. These areas, when followed, led directly to some of the most prestigious perfume houses in the city. It was then that the investigators realized the true extent of the fraud. The mastermind hadn't just been selling counterfeit perfume. They had been infiltrating some of Paris's most well-known perfume houses, using their reputation to sell fake fragrances under the guise of luxury. It wasn't just about creating an imitation of a fragrance. It was about capitalizing on the trust and prestige that these brands had built over decades. The shock of this revelation sent ripples through the perfume industry. The very idea that the perfume houses themselves had been targeted by the syndicate was staggering. The industry's very foundation of trust was crumbling, and no one was sure where the cracks might stop. The revelation that the mastermind had infiltrated Paris's most prestigious perfume houses shook the city to its core. For years, the perfume industry had been a symbol of French elegance, an iconic craft that blended art with luxury. Now, it appeared that even the most revered names in perfume could not escape the shadow of fraud. The question on everyone's mind was, how deep did this conspiracy go? As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to uncover the full scale of the operation. The mastermind's network of collaborators had infiltrated multiple levels of the perfume industry, from the small local boutiques to the major perfume houses. These perfume houses, many of which had been in business for generations, had unknowingly become a part of the fraud, their reputations tarnished by the very perfume bottles they had been selling. For the public, it was almost unthinkable. How could the perfume houses, with their long-standing history of excellence, have been duped so easily? The investigation focused on one particular perfume house, a well-known brand that had been around since the 19th century. It was here that the syndicate had managed to insert counterfeit bottles into the supply chain, masking them as limited edition, exclusive fragrances. The perfume house had long been a symbol of luxury, and their reputation for quality was unmatched. Yet, it was discovered that some of the most celebrated scents from this brand had been counterfeited and sold to wealthy buyers without their knowledge. The case began to take on a more personal tone for the perfume house's executives, whose livelihoods and legacies were now in jeopardy. The investigators worked tirelessly to trace the flow of counterfeit perfumes, identifying the exact points at which the fake fragrances had entered the legitimate supply chains. It was clear now that the mastermind was not only looking to profit from the sale of fake perfumes, but had also set their sights on undermining the very foundation of the industry. In one particularly dramatic moment, investigators discovered that the mastermind had gone so far as to use insider knowledge to create fake perfumes that matched the most sought-after, exclusive fragrances in the perfume house's lineup. They had studied the formulas, reverse-engineered the ingredients, and used the same bottles and packaging. For all intents and purposes, these counterfeit perfumes appeared completely legitimate, down to the last drop. The entire ordeal was a wake-up call for the perfume industry. Once regarded as untouchable, the high-end perfume market was now seen as vulnerable, its carefully guarded secrets exposed. The authorities now faced the daunting task of not only apprehending the mastermind, but also restoring public trust in the perfume industry. The city of Paris, once so proud of its perfumes, was left grappling with the aftermath of a fraud that had shaken the foundation of one of its most cherished industries. As the investigation into the mastermind's intricate scheme continued, the authorities found themselves in a race against time. The perfume industry, having lost its luster, faced a wave of disillusionment. Public confidence had been shattered, and the major perfume houses, once gleaming beacons of luxury, were scrambling to salvage their reputation. The most prestigious brands, whose very names were synonymous with quality and elegance, now found themselves tangled in a scandal they could scarcely comprehend. Meanwhile, the mastermind remained a ghost. Every lead seemed to dry up just before they could make an arrest. No matter how many times the authorities traced the trail of counterfeit goods or examined the meticulously forged documents, the person behind it all managed to slip further into the shadows. Paris's streets, once filled with the intoxicating scents of haute couture fragrances, now carried an unsettling scent of betrayal. But in the midst of this chaos, an unexpected breakthrough emerged. It came not from a high-ranking investigator or a secret informant, but from an unlikely source, an employee of one of the smaller perfume shops that had been caught up in the fraud. This employee had been working at the shop for years, mostly in the back room, overseeing deliveries and stock. She wasn't the type to draw attention to herself, but she had noticed something strange, something that had been nagging at her for months. It wasn't just one bottle, but several, which appeared to be perfectly legitimate perfumes, but they had arrived without any official documentation. When she saw the same unmarked delivery boxes that had been used in the smuggling operation, something clicked. Her gut told her that these deliveries weren't standard, they had been tampered with. She quietly alerted the authorities, not knowing just how important this piece of the puzzle would turn out to be. This seemingly small discovery led investigators straight to one of the key players in the syndicate, a man who had been flying under the radar, operating in the background of the perfume supply chain. His name was Charles Dubois, and he had been working as a supplier for several of Paris's most prestigious shops, often sourcing rare ingredients. He had managed to hide in plain sight, gaining the trust of perfume houses by supplying them with the finest oils. Little did they know, he was also at the heart of the syndicate's operation, providing the raw materials for the fake perfumes. It was Dubois's connections within the perfume world that had made the syndicate so successful. He knew the ins and outs of every major fragrance house, knew which ones would be susceptible to receiving counterfeit products without questioning them. His knowledge of the industry had made him an invaluable asset to the mastermind, and now his involvement was finally coming to light. With Charles Dubois now identified as a key player in the counterfeit perfume syndicate, the investigation took a decisive turn. The authorities had finally managed to corner one of the most elusive figures in the operation, but they knew that capturing Dubois was only the first step. His role as a supplier, deeply embedded in the perfume industry, meant he held the keys to the entire network, the names, the addresses, the connections that extended far beyond Paris. If they could get Dubois to talk, the mastermind behind the whole operation might finally be exposed. The interrogation of Dubois was tense. He was a man accustomed to handling delicate situations, someone who had built his career on discretion and trust within the perfume industry. However, as the investigators applied more pressure, it became clear that Dubois wasn't going to go down without a fight. He was skilled at hiding his true intentions, keeping his cards close to his chest, and for a while, it seemed like the authorities might hit another dead end. But there was a twist in the story. After several days of intense questioning, Dubois broke. Perhaps it was the mounting weight of the evidence or the realization that there was nowhere left to hide. Or maybe it was the clever tactics of the investigators that wore him down. In any case, Dubois finally gave them something they had been waiting for, a name. He didn't reveal the mastermind directly, but he provided a crucial link, an alias that had appeared in his records. The name was familiar to some investigators, though it had never surfaced in connection to the perfume scandal. A former perfume chemist turned entrepreneur, someone with a reputation for innovation in the fragrance industry. The chemist had disappeared from the public eye several years earlier, but it was now clear that they had been operating in the shadows, carefully crafting the counterfeit perfume empire. Dubois's revelation sent the investigation team in a new direction. They now knew who to look for, an elusive figure known as André Lefebvre. Lefebvre had once been celebrated for his groundbreaking work in fragrance design, but his fall from grace had been swift. Years ago, a scandal involving his own brand had tarnished his reputation, and he had vanished, leaving behind a trail of rumors and unanswered questions. It seemed that Lefebvre had resurfaced under a new identity, using his vast knowledge of the perfume industry to mastermind one of the most elaborate frauds Paris had ever seen. With this new lead, the investigation intensified. Lefebvre was no longer just a name on a list of suspects. He was now the prime target. The authorities worked tirelessly to track him down, following every lead, checking every connection that Dubois had revealed. But Lefebvre had been clever. He'd covered his tracks meticulously. Even with Dubois's information, the hunt for Lefebvre was far from straightforward. As the investigation narrowed in on André Lefebvre, the hunt became more urgent. Lefebvre was a master of disappearing, and his years of operating under various aliases had taught him how to cover his tracks expertly. Despite his previous fall from grace, Lefebvre had remained deeply connected to the world of fragrance, slipping into the underground world of counterfeit luxury. He had a sharp mind and knew how to manipulate the system, how to be invisible, and yet always one step ahead. The authorities began to piece together Lefebvre's movements, looking into old addresses, business connections, and even rumors. It was a meticulous process, one that took weeks, but eventually a breakthrough came. Lefebvre had recently resurfaced in a small town outside of Paris, in an area known for being a haven for retired industry professionals. He had been living under a new identity, working as a consultant for a local perfume distillery. The distillery, a seemingly innocent operation, was actually one of the final pieces of Lefebvre's extensive network. The authorities coordinated a covert operation to arrest Lefebvre. As the investigators moved in, they were aware that this could be the culmination of a long, frustrating case. Lefebvre wasn't just a criminal. He was a symbol of how easily the perfume industry's most guarded secrets could be exploited. But even as they closed in, the team was cautious. Lefebvre was not just a fraudster. He was a professional, and he would know how to escape if he sensed any danger. In the dead of night, with the town eerily quiet, the investigators surrounded Lefebvre's secluded residence. They had no idea what to expect. Would he be hiding in plain sight, or had he vanished again? With bated breath, they breached the door, and in a moment that felt like an eternity, they found Lefebvre sitting in a dimly lit room. He was calm, almost too calm. The walls were adorned with old perfume bottles, many of them rare and long forgotten. It was an eerie scene, a man surrounded by his past, unable to escape the world he had created. When Lefebvre was finally arrested, he didn't resist. Instead, he seemed almost resigned, as if he knew his time had come. The authorities had caught him, but not in the way they had expected. Lefebvre wasn't a man who would make a show of his downfall. He was methodical, detached, and quiet, traits that had helped him maintain his criminal empire for so long. The capture of Lefebvre was a victory for the authorities, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the case. Lefebvre would now be the key to unlocking the full extent of the counterfeit perfume syndicate. The authorities had finally cornered the mastermind, but they knew the story was far from over. They needed Lefebvre's cooperation to trace the money, find the other members of the network, and prevent the syndicate from regaining its footing. André Lefebvre's arrest was met with an eerie silence. Though he had been a criminal mastermind, there was something almost melancholic about the moment he was taken into custody. He didn't protest, didn't try to escape, and didn't even offer a word of defiance. It was as if he knew his game had come to an end, and now, the world he had built was crumbling. As the investigators sat down with him in the dimly lit interrogation room, they knew that they were about to hear the full story of one of the most audacious perfume frauds in history. The first hours of questioning were slow, tense. Lefebvre sat with his hands folded, his eyes calm yet distant. He didn't immediately offer up any details. Instead, he stared at the floor, as though lost in thought. The investigators were patient. They knew they couldn't rush him. Eventually, Lefebvre broke the silence, speaking softly but with an undeniable air of arrogance. "I created something beautiful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something no one else could ever replicate. I gave them what they wanted: luxury, exclusivity, and they fell for it. You all did." His words weren't filled with remorse. There was no apology, no recognition of the harm he had caused. Instead, Lefebvre spoke as though he were merely explaining the workings of a great artistic masterpiece, one that had been crafted with meticulous precision. For him, the counterfeit perfume syndicate wasn't a crime, it was an accomplishment. But as Lefebvre continued speaking, the investigators began to piece together the full story of how he had masterminded the entire operation. He had used his extensive knowledge of perfume making to reverse engineer some of the world's most famous fragrances. Working with a network of chemists, suppliers, and even a few former colleagues, Lefebvre had created near-perfect imitations of luxury perfumes. These counterfeits were so good that they could easily slip into the market without raising suspicion. He had sold them in bulk to shops across Europe, particularly in Paris, where they would be sold as high-end products at a fraction of the cost. He had made millions, operating quietly, using his connections to avoid detection. The perfect illusion of luxury was in the details. His counterfeit perfumes came in authentic-looking bottles, with labels that matched the originals down to the finest detail. But Lefebvre's greatest achievement wasn't just the creation of counterfeit fragrances. It was his ability to infiltrate the most respected names in the perfume industry. He had used his reputation as a former chemist to get inside some of Paris's most famous perfume houses. Once inside, he began to subtly insert his counterfeits into their supply chains. No one suspected anything. After all, he was a trusted figure in the industry, someone who had once been regarded as an innovator. The scale of the operation was staggering. Lefebvre's network spanned multiple countries and involved dozens of accomplices, each one a cog in the machine that kept the counterfeit perfumes flowing. Some of them were minor players, workers who manufactured bottles, label makers, and distributors. But there were also high-ranking figures in the perfume industry, people who had turned a blind eye to the counterfeit goods in exchange for a share of the profits. The operation had been so well constructed that it took years for anyone to catch on. But Lefebvre's downfall had come when the authorities began to investigate one small missing person case, which had led to a series of unconnected discoveries. The small cracks in his empire began to widen, and eventually, his elaborate scheme was exposed. As Lefebvre continued his tale of deception and intrigue, the investigators couldn't help but marvel at the complexity of the scheme. The way he spoke about it, it was clear he had seen himself not as a criminal, but as a visionary. He had disrupted an industry that prided itself on exclusivity, creating a new kind of luxury that was accessible to anyone willing to pay. For Lefebvre, his counterfeit perfumes weren't just products. They were works of art, crafted with the same care and precision as any original fragrance. Yet, as the details of the syndicate's operations came to light, it became obvious how much damage had been done. The perfume houses that had once been pillars of Parisian elegance were now tainted. The trust between suppliers and clients was shattered, and the carefully cultivated image of luxury had been exposed as a facade. Many of the shop owners who had unknowingly sold counterfeit perfumes faced financial ruin. Some had already lost their businesses, their reputations forever tarnished by the scandal. Lefebvre, however, didn't seem concerned with the fallout. His focus was always on the craft, the scent, the bottles, the labels. The emotional reactions from those who had purchased his counterfeit perfumes seemed irrelevant to him. He saw only the artistry of the process, his own cleverness, and the satisfaction of having outsmarted the elite perfume makers who had once looked down on him. But now, sitting in that dim interrogation room, Lefebvre realized that his carefully constructed world was falling apart. Despite his bravado, the walls were closing in. The authorities had enough evidence to convict him on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. And while he had been a master of deception, even he could see the inevitable truth. There was no way out. As Lefebvre sat silently, reflecting on his empire's collapse, the investigators pressed him further. They wanted names. They wanted the full network, who had helped him, who had been involved, and how far the operation had truly spread. Lefebvre hesitated at first, unwilling to betray the others who had been part of his scheme. But as the hours wore on, he finally began to name names, each revelation a small crack in the armor of the syndicate he had so carefully built. One by one, the members of Lefebvre's network were identified. There were suppliers in Belgium, distributors in Italy, and collaborators in Germany. The investigators were stunned by how vast the operation had truly been, spanning several countries and involving a wide range of people from the perfume industry. Some had been duped, others had been complicit. But Lefebvre was the mastermind, the one who had woven it all together, and with his confession, the entire syndicate began to unravel. It became clear that this wasn't just a crime about counterfeit perfume. It was a story of ambition, of a man who had tried to reshape an industry and had been willing to deceive, manipulate, and even destroy everything in his path to achieve that goal. His motivations, as misguided as they were, reflected a larger truth about the lengths some will go to in order to change the world around them, no matter the cost. The unraveling of Lefebvre's syndicate sent shockwaves through the perfume industry. With the mastermind finally behind bars and his network exposed, the investigators began their meticulous work of bringing the remaining members of the operation to justice. But as each lead was followed, it became apparent that Lefebvre's true crime wasn't just the counterfeit perfume. It was the way he had manipulated the very foundation of an industry, exploiting trust, reputation, and the allure of exclusivity. For the first time in years, the perfume houses of Paris began to question everything. How had they allowed this to happen? How had they been so blind to the creeping influence of counterfeit goods? The high-end perfume industry, once seen as a symbol of sophistication and luxury, now stood at a crossroads. Could it recover from this scandal, or had it been irrevocably tainted? Lefebvre's actions had struck at the heart of the industry. The counterfeit fragrances had been sold in prestigious stores, under the noses of the most elite clientele. These perfumes weren't just imitations. They had been cleverly marketed, slipped into the most exclusive boutiques, and even found in the homes of celebrities and socialites. Lefebvre's fraud wasn't just about making money. It was about making a statement. It was about proving that even the most established empires could be brought to their knees by a well-executed scheme. As the investigators worked to bring down the rest of the syndicate, the perfume industry was forced to reckon with its own role in the scandal. Major perfume houses were now under intense scrutiny. The public demanded answers. How could they have been so easily fooled by counterfeit perfumes, and why had they failed to notice the warning signs? The credibility of some of the most revered names in the fragrance world was now in question, and restoring trust would take time and effort. But even as the industry struggled to rebuild, there was a sense of relief. With Lefebvre's arrest and the dismantling of his network, a major threat had been neutralized. However, there was no denying that the damage had been done. The counterfeit perfumes that flooded the market were now being destroyed, but the legacy of the scandal would linger for years to come. For Lefebvre, the end was near. As he awaited trial, he remained largely indifferent to the chaos he had caused. In his eyes, he had simply been doing what no one else had dared to do, challenging the status quo. He had succeeded in disrupting an industry that had long been out of reach for the common person. In his twisted view, he had exposed the hypocrisy of an elite world that had prided itself on exclusivity. Despite his conviction, Lefebvre's impact on the perfume industry would not be easily forgotten. His legacy wasn't just about the fake perfumes. It was about the way he had shattered the illusion of luxury, revealing the vulnerabilities of an entire industry built on the idea of scarcity and prestige. As Lefebvre's trial approached, the atmosphere in Paris became thick with anticipation. The entire city was watching, waiting to see how the justice system would handle the mastermind behind one of the most audacious frauds in modern history. The perfume industry, once a symbol of Parisian elegance, now found itself in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. The trial was poised to become a spectacle, a chance for the public to hear Lefebvre's side of the story, to understand what had driven him to orchestrate such a vast and devious scheme. Lefebvre, ever the enigmatic figure, maintained his calm demeanor throughout the proceedings. He offered little in terms of defense, rarely speaking in court except to confirm details when prompted. His lack of remorse was palpable, and it only fueled the outrage of those who had been deceived. To the public, Lefebvre was the villain of the story, the one who had stolen not just money, but trust, the very currency of Parisian high society. But during the trial, something unexpected occurred. A few individuals, those who had worked with Lefebvre or had been part of his network, began to speak out. Some of them expressed regret for their involvement, revealing the intricate details of the syndicate's operations. It became clear that Lefebvre's influence had been more than just professional. It had been personal. He had convinced his collaborators that they were part of something bigger, that they were helping him reshape the perfume industry. For many of them, this wasn't just a crime, it was a twisted form of artistry, a rebellion against a system they felt was corrupt. The testimony of these individuals painted a complex picture of Lefebvre. He wasn't just a cold, calculating criminal. He was a man with a vision, albeit a deeply flawed one. His collaborators spoke of his charm, his ability to convince them that what they were doing was justified. It was clear that Lefebvre had an uncanny ability to inspire loyalty, even among those who were aware of the deception. His charisma had allowed him to manipulate people into believing that they were part of a revolutionary movement, rather than a criminal enterprise. As the trial wore on, it became clear that Lefebvre's fate was sealed. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The counterfeit perfumes had been traced back to his factory, and the records he had so carefully maintained were now being used to convict him. The once proud perfume industry of Paris, with its centuries of tradition, had been brought to its knees by one man's ambition. The day of the verdict arrived, and Lefebvre was found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and more. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his reputation in tatters. As he was led away in handcuffs, there was no expression of victory on his face. Lefebvre had never been one to bask in the glory of his crimes. For him, it had never been about the money. It had been about the challenge, the art of deception, the ability to pull off something so elaborate that no one would ever see it coming. But despite his personal sense of triumph, the impact of Lefebvre's scheme would continue to be felt for years to come. The perfume industry, while beginning to recover, would never be the same. The trust that had once been its cornerstone was now fractured, and it would take time for the public to regain confidence in the industry's products. Lefebvre's downfall had not just exposed a criminal mastermind, it had exposed the fragile nature of luxury itself. It revealed how easily something could be fabricated and sold as real, how the illusion of exclusivity could be shattered by a single clever deception. The world of high-end perfumes, once untouchable, was now vulnerable. And as Lefebvre sat in his prison cell, it became clear that the legacy of his crime would forever change the way luxury goods were perceived. As Lefebvre sat in prison, reflecting on the events that had led him to this point, the ripple effects of his actions continued to be felt throughout Paris and the perfume world. His conviction marked the end of an era where the illusion of luxury reigned supreme, and the finest perfumes were revered as untouchable works of art. But the truth had been laid bare, and Paris now had to come to terms with the reality that even the most cherished industries were susceptible to deceit. In the years that followed Lefebvre's arrest and conviction, the perfume industry underwent a profound transformation. The high-end fragrance houses, once steeped in secrecy and exclusivity, now found themselves forced to adapt to a new world, one where transparency and authenticity were no longer optional, but essential. New regulations were introduced, ensuring that every bottle of perfume, every ingredient, and every batch was traced and verified. It was a system designed to protect both the consumer and the integrity of the industry. But this shift wasn't easy. Many perfume houses, having once thrived on the mystique of their formulas, now found themselves under a microscope. The very idea that their fragrances could have been substituted with counterfeits was a blow to their reputations. Some of the most established names in the industry struggled to regain the trust of their clientele. The market for luxury perfumes was no longer the same, and the industry had to adapt to this new, uncertain reality. Despite the industry's efforts to recover, the legacy of Lefebvre's scheme lingered in the air like the faintest whiff of perfume. Consumers were now more skeptical, more cautious, and the demand for authenticity was greater than ever. While counterfeit perfumes had been destroyed, the psychological impact of the fraud was not so easily erased. For some, the idea of purchasing luxury perfumes now came with a lingering doubt. Could they be getting the real thing, or were they being duped again? Meanwhile, Lefebvre's name became a cautionary tale, a symbol of how ambition, when unchecked by ethics, could bring even the most revered industries to their knees. His story was told and retold in the media, in documentaries, and in whispered conversations among perfume lovers. He was remembered not as a mere criminal, but as a figure who had changed the landscape of luxury goods forever. His legacy was a paradox, a criminal mastermind who had exposed the fragility of exclusivity, while also proving that the desire for luxury was so powerful, it could be exploited. Years after Lefebvre's trial, his name was still known in perfume circles. While many had hoped his fall from grace would mark the end of the counterfeit perfume epidemic, it was clear that the battle for authenticity was ongoing. The industry, though recovering, would forever carry the stain of Lefebvre's fraud, and the lessons learned from his audacious scheme would continue to shape the future of luxury goods. As for Lefebvre, he remained silent in his cell, perhaps content with the knowledge that his legacy would outlast his prison sentence. He had created something lasting, something no one could take away from him, not even the justice system. The irony was bitter. In his quest to challenge the very foundation of luxury, he had become a part of it. A man who had built his empire on deception, but who, in the end, had crafted a legacy that would never fade. Now, as you drift deeper into the quiet of this tale, let the lessons linger. Sometimes, the most valuable things in life aren't the ones that can be bought or sold. They are the things that stand the test of time, things built on trust, transparency, and authenticity. So, with that, let the perfume of this story settle into your mind, soft and gentle, as you drift into rest.